Becoming a techno wizard. Today, I'm continuing my series about learning on learning about Hegel with Dr. Sadler, and just gonna jump right into it because we got a lot to cover. It's been been a little while. Um, to recap, the last section we went over sections 54 through 55 of the preface to the Phenomenology of Spirit. My recap for this section was as follows. I said. During this section, we get into the concept of concepts. Hegel shows us the progression of how philosophers have defined existence to be more and more determinate, from nous or mind by Anaxagoras to Plato's ideas or forms, i.e., eidos, to Aristotle's universals, species, and kind, and on to Hegel's own notion of concepts. He shows that this process of making the abstract nature of thought more definite and qualitative allows for existence to become intelligible and creates reasonability. As always, Dr. Sadler provides helpful context, explaining that this section outlines a historical idealist philosophy. So, yeah, um, let's see if it's close to Dr. Sadler's introduction or explanation of the last section. He says, in these sections, Hegel explicitly introduces the idealist standpoint and situates his own philosophy with the historical progress in understanding the relationship between being and thought. For Hegel, being is thought, but not the way previous idealists have construed it. In order to grasp being, we cannot simply superimpose our own thought upon it, but must ourselves thoughtfully attend to the content and its development and determinate concrete existence. Interesting. Hegel situates these insights within a historical progression from Anaxagoras, who understand that mind, nous, is the essence of reality, to Plato, who introduces a more determinate notion under idea of or form, eidos, to Aristotle, who goes still further with determinate universality, species, or kind. So yeah, so we kind of touched on it in opposite ways or in reverse ways, and he he touched on this the idealist standpoint, and that's what I missed in my explanation. So I like that recovery there, that explanation there for Hegel. Being is thought. That's powerful. Because I remember he was talking about the idea that you know the very existence of things requires some level of internal cognizance, right? Yeah, well, we're probably going to get further into it, but I do like that idea. So let's see here. Here we go. All right. Without further ado, let us begin.
It is in this nature of what is to be in its being its own notion that logical necessity in general consists. This alone is the rational element and the rhythm of the organic whole. It is as much knowledge of the content as the content is the notion and essence. In other words, it alone is speculative philosophy.
Mm.
The self-moving, concrete shape makes itself into a simple determinateness. In so doing, it raises itself to logical form and exists in its essentiality. Its concrete existence is just this movement and is directly a logical existence.
Yes, that's the term right there. The self-moving, right? Uses that term to describe like the fact that the existence of a thing is holds within itself its ability to kind of move through our understanding of that thing as we think about it. um uh that kind of thing kind of moves itself through our minds and through our reality and things like that. Maybe not physically obviously, but like in terms of our understanding of that thing. And I like this idea right here of a speculative philosophy. And it is as much knowledge of the content as the content is the notion and the essence. In other words, it alone is speculative philosophy. And for what I understand about speculative fiction and things like that is that it is it is in essence a thing of thought, right? It's providing critical thought to a subject and thinking about like, okay, how can this idea or this concept or this genre be, applied, how can this future, like speculative futures, right? It requires you to think about the future in different ways than usually, because usually we kind of have a default idea of the future or fiction or whatever, and we kind of go in those tropes. But with speculative, you kind of are expressing, or rather adventuring, exploring. I think that's a good term. Exploring um, avenues that you don't usually think about. So at least that's how I see this idea here.
Itself to logical form and exists and is directly a logical existence. It is for this reason unnecessary to clothe the content in an external logical formalism. The content is in its very nature the transition into such formalism,
Mm.
but a formalism which ceases to be external, since the form is the innate development of the concrete content itself.
Mm. Right. I really like that idea too. Goodness, spitting already. It is for this reason unnecessary to clothe the content in an external logical formalism. So going back to formalism, the idea that you can, set a formula, right, a shape that is external to the thing itself. Like for instance, saying, "Oh, the universe is a machine," right? You're using the external form, like the universe itself in, is the concept that you're actually thinking about, but you're using the analogy of a machine to describe the universe. But in so doing, right, you kind of are losing the beauty of the universe itself. You're losing the concept of the universe, and you're replacing it with that of the machine, right? And it goes way too far, because oftentimes they say, "Oh no, not this." Hegel mentions this earlier. He says, it's like the idea where you say, "Oh, it's not just like a machine; it is a machine." Right? A lot of the 19th century and probably 18th century philosophers and scientists and things like that were like, "Yes, the universe is a machine, and it behaves like thus, and we can, you can." They insist that it works in this perfectly, determinable way. But in reality, there's so much about the universe that we have no idea about, that it's really ridiculous to call it a machine. So using that external form, right, that external formalism to describe this thing that we're trying to understand, actually reduces it. It's reductive. And so what he's saying here is that when you think about the universe itself for what it is, right, just the act of thinking about it creates its own form. Because what is the universe but the universe, right? As in, we then describe things in terms of the universe. We say, "Oh, that's like its own little universe there," right? So the concept that we're thinking about, that we're trying to understand, is self-moving, right? It becomes its own concrete form to describe itself. And that might seem circular, but this is, I think, Hegel's kind of point here, is that it's spherical, right? It goes inwards and outwards, and it seems like it's circular, but it actually moves you in some way, right? So yeah, I really like this idea here, because it's so practical, and we see this in a lot of different methods and areas.
In this section, number 56, and in several of the ones that are going to immediately follow, Hegel is telling us about necessity again, and also telling us why it's not only not needed, but a bad idea to approach all of these matters that the phenomenology is going to be a phenomenology, that is a viewing, a sort of systematic watching and putting these things together. Why it's a bad idea to approach this in a formalist, schematic way, as we've seen him reject before. So why is that? He's saying that logical necessity, and first I have the English, then I have the German here. Logical necessity, as such, consists in some way in a being being its own notion. And, there's one of those phrases where we say, well, I got you up to this point. What are you actually talking about here? And it's tempting very often. I know this temptation myself when you get, where Hegel's going in general, and you understand bits and pieces of the systematic approach that seem very attractive, and you want to get to later chapters where, more is going on, to say, well, I don't really get this, but I'm sure it'll become clear as I go along, and then never come back to it. So we don't want to do that here. Making it even more murky, I've got the actual German for it up, and it's sort of a tongue twister. In seinem Sein, sein Begriff zu sein. This is what it is for a thing to actually, express or entail logical necessity. In seinem Sein, that is, in its being, sein Begriff, its notion translated here, or its concept, zu sein, to be. So, for its being to be its concept. And
its being to be its concept.
I think if you put it that way, it becomes a little bit more clear now. What this is saying is logical necessity is where being and concept are finally, if not coinciding, because sein here doesn't have to be doesn't have to be seen as a pure identity statement, but rather to say that these are actually aligned with each other in such a way that the concept reveals to us the being is revealing itself through our very engagement with it through the concept, and the concept is...
Sorry, I gotta speed this up a little bit, because very fascinating, but I'm thinking like of so many things, so I need to focus more. Like this sein Begriff. But that's basically what I was saying, right? This seems like I'm on track. Let's see.
Is not related to the being in an arbitrary way, but in a necessary way. It is expressing what it is for that being to be, which is for it to be the kind of being that it is, the concept of that being. Hopefully that's totally clear now. Probably not though, right? So it says, this is what speculative philosophy really consists of. He tells us a few other things that help us sort of fill in, the gaps on this. He says, the content is the notion and the essence. So what it is that, the being is, its content, what we can say about it, what we can know about it, is this notion, this systematic grasp, and the essence. When we've actually, made it to figuring out what something is, we are grasping its essence. The content that we're engaged in knowledge of the content as well, and these two in one sentence are connected together. So knowledge of the content involves this being the case that the content is the notion and the essence. We don't want to say, well, therefore knowledge is of the concept, because it's a little bit more tricky than that. Why? Well, because what he's calling shapes here, translating the term Gestalt, self-moving, concrete, Gestalt, or no, it's actually singular, sorry. Self-moving, the self-moving concrete shape makes itself into a determinateness. This is what we've looked at the logical structure of earlier, this self-othering process that involves becoming determinate and sort of taking this back into itself. We can look at this in a multiple different modes. Abstraction turns out to be not just identity, pure identity, but also non-identity, because the thing is not the same thing as the abstraction of it, but it's related to it. All of these give us a fuller and fuller conception of the thing. They do contribute knowledge to us. Now, he says, as the self-moving concrete Gestalt, or form, or shape, makes itself into a determinateness, here's where it gets really interesting, it raises itself into logical form. So another way of looking at this would be that when we are actually, as phenomenologists, as those engaging in this historical inquiry into consciousness and consciousness as objects, when we're actually being attentive, when we're not just sort of superimposing our own preconceived notions onto this, then the content itself will give us clues about how it ought to be schematized, how it ought to be arranged. And you don't have to be Hegel to figure this out. I mean, all you really have to do is be involved with any sort of craft work and where there's material, and you'll realize very quickly that whatever you came to the material with, whatever preconceived ideas about how it's going to work and how it ought to work, if those happen to align with the realities of the material, good for you. Otherwise, the material is going to kick it back to you and say, I'm not doing that. I'm doing what I want to do, and if you want to come along for the ride, here's what you can do. I mean, you can think about carving, for example, wood carving. You carve generally with the grain. You can, of course, chisel against the grain, and there's all sorts of special cuts you can do. But if you're trying to just approach the material from the outside and say you're going to do exactly this, well, you may as well just be pouring concrete then, right? Or doing plastic molding, rather than actually working with something that has its own grain, its own texture, its own structure to it. And so Hegel is saying,
This is a good freaking point right here. I love that he called this out. This idea that it's learning things and coming at knowledge to try and understand, the shape of knowledge is very much like crafting, right? Crafting out of wood or, any other material that has its own, form, that has its own movement, has its own grain and wood structure, whatever, right? You got to go with the flow of that thing. If you try to kind of force your own will upon it and say, "Oh, yeah, this is what you're gonna be," and I'm gonna, it's very hard to make it work like that, and usually it doesn't, right? Usually you break the thing or whatever. But in terms of knowledge, right? In terms of um, understanding, breaking the thing means breaking your own understanding of that thing. And so it's even more, dangerous for you to go against the grain of trying to understand a knowledge type of thing. Um, because like you won't even realize that you've broken it, right? Because you've internalized or you tried to, you know, to grasp something um immaterial and you can't feel it when it breaks. And if you're not really at a level where you can tell when something feels wrong, then you're just gonna accept it. You're like, oh yeah, I guess that's just how it works. And you're gonna have this wrong understanding of things just because you were trying to force your own, mode upon, the world. So I really like this metaphor here. It's very powerful.
things will give us their logical structure. So he says, concrete existence is just this movement and is directly a logical existence. We're experiencing this long before we, even if we never decide to, come to Hegel's phenomenology or even philosophy in general. This is part of what it is to be human, is to be attentive to things out there. Sometimes, it's superimposing our own conceptions onto it. He's not saying never do that, but he is saying that a lot of our concrete existence is learning from the objects. Hey, this is how I'm supposed to be understood. This is the kind of thing that I am. So he says it's unnecessary to clothe the content in an external logical formalism. The content is, in its very nature, the transition into such formalism, but a formalism that ceases to be external. So you see, Hegel's not against formalism per se. He's against formalism that doesn't take its cues from that which is to be formalized, that is the objects, the content that is supposed to be grasped for consciousness by means of the notion. So he says the form is the innate development of the concrete content itself. As these things expose themselves to us and we engage with them, and many of these things, by the way, are human realities, not just say material things or natural objects, we are ourselves learning how to conceptualize them, how to bring them into the notion. And this is not just us, sort of sitting back and ideas popping in our head, Hegel thinks. We're actually in a relationship with the thing and learning about what is in that thing. Now, it exists for us in our thought, as we pointed out earlier. This is an idealism. So that, it's not as if the alien thing is way out there and is, we're sort of realizing what's inside of it that we would never otherwise have had access to. But it's not just all on our side. It's also on the side of the thing.
Love it. And I think I
This
was right
nature
on
of
top there.
scientific
So
method, which consists partly in not being separate from the content and partly in spontaneously determining the rhythm of its movement, has, as already remarked, its proper exposition in speculative philosophy. Of course, what has been said here does express the notion, but cannot count for more than an anticipatory assurance. Its truth does not lie in this partly narrative exposition, and is therefore just as little refuted by asserting the contrary, by calling to mind and recounting conventional ideas, as if they were established in familiar truths, or by dishing up something new with the assurance that it comes from the shrine of inner divine intuition. A reception of this kind is usually the first reaction on the part of knowing to something unfamiliar. It resists it, in order to save its own freedom and its own insight, its own authority, from the alien authority. For this is the guise in which what is newly encountered first appears. And to get rid of the appearance that something has been learned and of the sort of shame this is supposed to involve. Similarly, where the unfamiliar is greeted with applause, the reaction is of the same kind and consists in what another sphere would take the form of ultra-revolutionary speech and action. Another sphere would take
kind
the
of
form of similarly, where the
went
unfamiliar
by
is greeted with
fast there. So I think there was something here I want to touch on. A recession of this kind is usually the first in reaction to partner is something unfamiliar. It resists in it order to save its own freedom and its own insight, its own authority from the alien authority for that This is the guise in which what is newly in character first appears, and to get rid of the appearance that something has been learned, and of the sort of shame that is supposed to be involved, that this is supposed to involve. Yeah. So I like this part right here. It resists. I mean, I like all of it, but this part kind of hit me. It resists it in order to save its own freedom, and in its own insight, its own authority from the alien authority. Right. So when you try to understand a thing for what it is, right, rather than trying to use alien authority, some other idea, some external form to, impose your understanding of it, your idea of what you think it should be, right? Instead of doing that, it can, resist that. It can through its own, when it has its own freedom, right? You can gain, I mean, its own insight, right? You can gain your own understanding of what that is through its own thing. Um, it didn't really need explanation, but like, yeah, I just wanted to highlight that part. Yeah. Let's
To
see.
once again, contrast the scientific method that's entailed in
Ask
Section
you something.
57, speech and action. In Section 57, Hegel is going to once again, contrast the scientific method that's entailed in speculative philosophy, in dialectical, conceptual philosophy, against a few other rivals, you could say, that are prevalent not only in his culture but also in our own. And we'll come to those in a moment. But I actually want to skip ahead a little bit towards the bottom of the paragraph, because he's talking about something that happens when we encounter forms of thought that are unfamiliar to us. He says that a reception of this kind is usually the first reaction on the part of knowing, so somebody who already is engaged in knowledge, some systematization, some putting things together, their first reaction to something unfamiliar. And not just unfamiliar in the sense of, well, here's a new content and I haven't encountered this before. We'll take a very trivial example. Bubblegum. When I was a kid, there were just a few kinds of gum at first. And then there was this bubblegum explosion. And, not only did we have bubblegum flavor, but also cherry flavor and grape flavor. And we thought this is so great. Bubblicious and
Nowadays,
Bubble
it's
out.
absolutely
And then
insane.
after a while, they started going hog wild with that and just, introducing all sorts of crazy flavors. And some of us said, that's enough. There's too many crazy flavors,
Flavor
peach, that's
brain.
fine, but this thing over here, I don't even know what that's
Fire
supposed to be
makes
or
you
what it's supposed to
feel.
taste like. I think you just mixed a bunch of chemicals together, and, in the ad industry, they say, throw it at the wall and see if it sticks. That's what they did. And so I could be, I've got knowledge about bubblegum, and this is not, scientific knowledge in the sense that I'm, analyzing it in the lab, but, experiential knowledge, right? I'm a kid who, would shell out money, so there's a stake in it for different flavors of bubblegum, and we would compare notes among the kids. So there's a process of inquiry going on there, right? And, since I'm paying money for it, it actually matters to me. If I'm going to buy this pack, I want to know that that's actually going to taste like something decent. And, maybe somebody else buys a pack, they'll swap you one for one, because the packs always had 5 big cubes of gum in them. And now you try it, and you're like, what the hell is this? That's new content, right? It's not requiring you to sort of radically change your way of understanding things. It's just new content. It's adding a little bit to your knowledge base in this one area. Now, there's other kinds of knowledge, there's other objects of knowledge which call more into question. You can think of them as having sort of a ripple effect, where this is new, and if this is new, and it's something real, and it's something I do need to take into account, that's going to call into question a lot of these other things as well. Think about when you first tell somebody about the notion of emotional intelligence. And you can break it down for them. Well, it consists in being able to identify your emotions, being able to identify other people's emotions, having some rudimentary knowledge of how emotions work, being able to sort of empathize with other people, project how they're going to feel. There's a whole bunch of different components to this. Once you start to learn about this, people often have those, light bulb going on moments, and they say, oh yeah, now that I understand this, I've been misunderstanding this stuff over here all this time. Now, that's a positive reaction. Hegel talks about negative reactions that people have to that sort of thing as well. He says, it resists it in order to save its own freedom and its own insight. A lot of times when people encounter a new way of looking at things, they say, if it can't fit into what I already know, I don't want to know about it. Why? Because it makes them feel unfree. And it makes them feel like they don't know what they're actually doing. And the more that people have invested in what Hegel would call self-certainty, Gewissheit, the more damaging this is to the stance that they're currently in. The more,
See, I do this sometimes. I took the wrong understanding of that passage because I took that part out. This is why I'm watching this with Dr. Sadler. I can catch all these things, so I'm not totally off base here. Um, but yeah, so he I missed that whole context there. So this is a great recovery there.
Frightening it is for their shape of consciousness, to the point where it could actually, induce such anxiety that it counts as something like the fear of death that's going to be talked about later on in the self-consciousness section. So Hegel is isolating two elements here. He's saying they want to preserve their own freedom, because there is a freedom in thinking that he's going to talk about a lot in the next section, and they want to preserve their own insight, their own authority from the alien authority. The alien authority, the new way of looking at things, is coming in as an alien authority and saying, well, you didn't have it all figured out, and as a matter of fact, we're probably going to have to retool quite a bit of your stock here, and it's going to be a bit disruptive for a while. How long? Well, we don't know. We're going to have to see how badly off you actually are. So they want to, like he says, get rid of the appearance that something has been learned and of the sort of shame or embarrassment, feeling lower that this is supposed to involve. Learning requires humility. The Latin word docility literally means teachability. Somebody who is not docile, somebody who is not open and receptive, really can't be taught an awful lot. Certainly nothing that matters, particularly. And oftentimes we need to shake them up a bit in order to be able to do that. And speculative philosophy is going to shake them up. So he says, speculative philosophy works with the notion. I'm giving you an outline here. I'm giving you sort of a narration. I'm not saying that this is the whole shebang. So don't read the preface and say, well, what about this, and what about this, and what about this? We'll get to that later on. But I'm giving you the main outlines. What are people going to oppose to that? He says, well, two things quite common. Conventional ideas, things that are already established, taken as being true, as sort of environment that we have to work in. Well, this isn't really worth doing because my philosophy teacher told me that Hegel's too hard and incomprehensible and nobody really works with him anyway except for a few weird, wacky continental people. Well, that'd be an example of a conventional idea. A lot of people do have that idea. Can you do anything with it? Yeah, you can reject Hegel and save yourself the time of actually reading something. Is that an adequate approach to things? Not really. You probably need to check it. I mean, if you're actually curious about whether there's anything to this, you actually have to spend the time, do the work, and think it through. And then you're probably going to find out that those conventional ideas not only are false, but actually have a place within the phenomenology where Hegel can actually tell you how and why they're false. That's one of the things that's interesting about his perspective. Also, people like Alistair MacIntyre, who is in a certain way Hegelian in what he does, influenced through Collingwood, of course. Another thing that people do is they come up with something new, something that's a little bit easier to grasp, but doesn't have the same graspability or comprehensibility, the same begrifflichkeit. Begriffen is to grasp, right? To sink your claws into, to get a hold of. And there's some things that appear superficially graspable. They sound plausible, and they sound cool quite often, but really there's not a lot to them. And people say, well, you either got to get it or you don't get it, man. And that's what Hegel's calling intuition. He says they come up with something new by intuition. If we want to be very facetious, we talk about people pulling things out of their rear ends. That's what he's talking about there. And those are both responses that people will have so that they don't have to do this kind of work over here.
Right.
What, therefore, is important in the study of science is that one should take on oneself the strenuous effort of the notion. This requires attention to the notion as such, to the simple determinations, that is, of being as such, being for itself, self-identity, and so forth. For these are pure self-movements, such as could be called souls, if their notion did not designate something higher than soul. The habit of picture thinking, when it is interrupted by the notion, finds it just as irksome as does formalistic thinking that argues back and forth in thoughts that have no actuality. That habit should be called material thinking, a contingent consciousness that is absorbed only in material stuff, and therefore finds it hard work to lift the thinking self clear of such matter and to be with itself alone. At the opposite extreme are...
Hold up. Reread that. So the habit of picture thinking, when it is interrupted by the notion, finds it just as irksome as does formalistic thinking that argues back and forth in thoughts that have no actuality. All right. So what does it mean by picture thinking? It's like the viewing of the bigger picture of like getting this image of a thing, when interrupted by the notion, or like I guess this trying to get a concept of a something. This is interesting. Finds it just as irksome as does formalistic thinking that argues back and forth and thoughts that have. So he's sounds like he's saying here, picture thinking, whatever that is like just as bad or just as problematic as formalism, as formalistic thinking. Not sure what he means by picture thinking. I think when you have this, you think you have an understanding of a thing, but you're viewing it as like a static picture, right? Like a snapshot of the first time you saw it, or a snapshot of the when you learned it, or something like that. And that's how you're thinking of this concept, as opposed to as its own dynamic kind of form that is sort of immaterial. Uh, it's concrete, it can be concrete in understanding, but it's not in terms of how it's fixated in your mind, right? It's not a picture. It's um it's nebulous in a way, right? So maybe that's what he's saying here. That habit should be called material thinking, a contingent consciousness that is absorbed only in material stuff, and therefore finds it hard work to lift the thinking self clear of such matter and be with it alone. Interesting, right? So what he's saying is that picture thinking is basically material thinking. It's like when you think of things as objects. Objects, have a material kind of solid form, but it kind of roots you, kind of grounds you in that thing, as opposed to where you need to be if you want to understand these kind of nebulous concepts, um, which is alone with this um, nebulous concept, right? Alone with this thing that you're trying to understand, separate from a material, a solidified, imagery, if you will. So I don't know if that's what he's saying there, but very interesting. Oops.
Interrupted by the notion, finds it just as called material thinking, a contingent, and to be with itself alone. At the opposite extreme, argumentation is freedom from all content, and a sense of vanity towards it. What is looked for here is the effort to give up this freedom. And instead of being the arbitrarily moving principle of the content, to sink this freedom in the content, letting it move spontaneously of its own nature, by the self, as its own self, and then to contemplate this movement.
Mm.
This refusal...
Somebody said, "Hey," somebody's in the comments. "Hello, I don't know who you are." Just says phone lawless, but hello, welcome to the stream. Um, have you been reading up with us so far? Do you know about Hegel and these concepts that we're in? Happy to have you here. Let me see here. It's the opposite extreme. Argumentation is freedom from all content and a sense of vanity towards it. That's interesting take right there. It reminds me of like the debate bros and bread tube type of type of thing. It's almost masturbatory. Um, what is looked for here is the effort to give up this freedom, and instead of being the arbitrarily moving principle of the content, to sink this freedom in the content. Interesting, right? So sometimes, like we have this understanding. Oh, let me finish. As I said, letting it move spontaneously of its own nature by the self as its own self, and to contemplate this movement. So it seems to me that this is relating to the idea, like we were saying earlier, what Dr. Sadler was saying earlier, that we want to be like have this freedom, but when you come up to a new concept, it kind of limits you because it's like, oh wow, this is space where I didn't know that was there, and therefore I can't go there, right? We don't usually go into things that are unknown. It marks the zone of like our territory. Like this is okay. This is what I'm comfortable with, and anything past here, I don't know there, because so that's technically a limitation of your freedom, right? And so the same thing happens in your mind as you're understanding these different concepts. When you come up against an unknown thing, it limits your freedom, and that can be scary, right? When you come up against that barrier. But what he's saying here is that we need to, kind of sink our freedom in the content, kind of explore that unknown, so we can learn from it. We can let it, let it show us the way, if you will. So it's very interesting. No problem that you haven't, read Hegel so far. Again, happy to see you here. Hopefully, you can get something fun from this stream. Let's continue
to
here.
intrude into the immanent rhythm of the notion, either arbitrarily or with wisdom obtained from elsewhere, constitutes a restraint which is itself an essential moment of the notion.
Right. Okay.
In section 58, Hegel is going to contrast three different approaches against each other. These are ones that actually play a very important role, you might say, in his history of thought. And Vorstellung, or Vorstellen, the verb or the noun, they play an important place along the way. He also identifies what he's calling here argumentation or raisonnieren, with sort of the philosophy of the understanding. So if you actually go on to look through Hegel's other works, you're going to find these playing a very important role as preliminary steps that don't realize that they're preliminary steps, and that's why they end up being insufficient. So he tells us that science, Wissenschaft, requires the strenuous effort of the notion. It means that we have to work not only to penetrate into the content and allow the content to speak to us, to dictate its own categories to us, but we have to be even more rigorous with respect to this. It can't just be a sort of, man, the ocean's going to talk to me about what kind of thing it is. We have to conceptualize it. We have to try to grasp it. It's an active process both ways. And so he actually brings up some metaphysical determinations in this, what he calls simple determinations. Examples of these are being in itself. What is being in itself? Well, that requires an analysis. And it turns out, here's the punchline for everything Hegelian. Everything that you analyze always turns out to be something quite different than what you originally thought it was. So being in itself, being for itself, self-identity. He says these are pure self-movements such as could be called souls, because they are self-moving, right? The soul is self-moving in traditional philosophy. If their notion did not designate something higher than soul. Now, he doesn't talk about this, but I think that we also ought to read into the strenuousness of the effort of the notion that we're also entering into.
Here you go. Phone says, I feel like I should read Hegel because I feel like it's related to in-group, out-group theory in some way, and it might be useful for me to learn. Yeah, I don't really know much about in-group, out-group theory as an idea, besides, ideas around tribalism and things like that. But I think a lot of this here does speak to, it's just good stuff to know. It speaks to a wide area of knowledge in terms of how we think about things and how we know things and, what makes a good system of knowledge and what does not. Again, I'm only in the beginning, so who knows? But from what I've 50 sections into this preface, and it's been just bars on bars, you know, insights on insights. So I think it's a good thing to step into, and yeah, you can check it out yourself. What do you mean by in-group out-group theory? I'd love to know more about that.
The content of the notion, its concreteness. He's just been talking about this. He perhaps doesn't think that he needs to talk about it at this point, re-emphasize it, but I think that given the nature of this, sort of course, it's worth emphasizing that these two go along with each other. These simple determinations, like being in itself, are getting used to illuminate the concrete actualities, the experiential things.
Phone says, I've seen it used in analysis and Afro-pessimism, so it must be pretty useful to learn. Oh yeah, yeah. Again, I haven't heard of Afro-pessimism. That's a new term for me. But that's awesome that you've seen it in other places.
That we're running into. That's the content of the notion. Now, he says science has to do a lot of work to develop a sort of systematic understanding of these things that it can actually justify to itself. And he opposes two other types of thinking to this. So he talks about picture thinking first, and he says, the habit of picture thinking, when it's interrupted by the notion, finds it irksome, as formalistic thinking that argues back and forth in thoughts that have no actuality. That's more the raison d'être. Now, picture thinking is when people actually have a very determinate understanding of things. And this can be very important things. An example of this is in the lectures on the philosophy of religion. Picture thinking actually takes you quite a ways, but we have to get beyond that to conceptual thinking towards the notion, the concept.
Okay, so I was right, yeah.
And what he highlights here is the fact that picture thinking thinks in terms of images. These don't necessarily have to be visual images. These could be verbalizations. These could be things that are heard, imaginations, And he talks about it in terms of habit, and he says it should be called material thinking, a contingent consciousness that is absorbed only in material stuff, therefore finds it hard work to lift the thinking self clear of such.
So phone says, well, I can have this thing. Let me put it on the screen. I can have this thing where I believe in-group, out-group theory misunderstands racism and, in the case of its relation to tribalism, can be racist itself. Again, I'm not sure exactly understanding here. Love to hear more. But from when I'm gleaning from this, I believe in-group, out theory misunderstands racism. And in case of relation to tribalism, can be racist itself. Interesting. But I feel like I need to study it more to flesh out that idea. It mostly comes from what little interaction with the concept. I guess that you have. All right. Well, I always love to talk about it when you get a solid idea of it. But it it does sound interesting already because I've been looking into tribalism and things like that, and an interesting aspect of that people don't seem to talk about is the reality that tribalism isn't necessarily bad, right? We kind of use this term pejoratively, especially we use the term tribes, very much pejoratively to kind of deconnotate, so-called less advanced or barbarians or savages, type of stuff. But reality, a tribe is just any group of people, right, that fundamentally, come together. Gonna go shopping, but I'll be lurking. All right, no problem. Thanks for dropping by. I really appreciate it. Might be ending soon, but yeah, you got me thinking about this stuff now. I might have to look into this because yeah, like it's interesting that we kind of view tribalism as like, oh, this is a bad thing, but really it's just groups. It's just groups of people coming together for a specific purpose or for an identity or for a task or whatever, right? So it's not necessarily bad. When it only becomes bad when it becomes, kind of territorial or, adversarial, right? When you view your group as better than another group, for no real reason, just because you're in the group and they're out the group, right? I guess that's what you mean by in-group, out-group theory. Is like because you're out, then we kind of view you as different, as less than, or whatever. So yeah, I think there's a lot of stuff there, and then yeah, I might have to look into that more. Thanks for bringing that up.
Matter to do with itself alone, to think in these sorts of determinations of the concept. And he's right about this. Very often when people are doing picture thinking, take for example the notion of freedom. People have a very determinate
Mm,
conception of freedom. They belong to a political party or a political movement. And here we're dealing with an idea, but it's also probably tied in with some emotional resonances, with some very determinate, understandings of this is freedom, that's not freedom. And then they encounter somebody else who has a different conception of freedom, because there's multiple conceptions, and they find themselves unable to engage in the back and forth and very long,
mm,
and they find themselves having to sort of just reinforce their position. They find others who agree with them, who are
hmm.
part of that community. We understand freedom. They don't get it. And you can see this playing itself out in American politics all the time, between
Yes.
right and left, and the coalitions that represent them, the Republican and Democratic parties.
This is I love this topic because I've been learning about a lot about this, and this goes into Cony Rock, right? So David Rengel and Graeber's book, the New Science of, or what is it called? The Dawn of Everything. Goodness, yeah, the Dawn of Everything. They go into Rock's kind of arguments and things like that. So Rock was a Native American from, I think, one of the Iroquois peoples. I forgot which one, but Rock was a Native American back in the 1500s or something like that. There when pilgrims were coming to America. Might have been the 1400s for all I know. So, but nonetheless, he actually went over to Europe and did all these kind of essays and orations and things like that, speeches talking about how the European concept of freedom is inherently not free, right? Is inherently limiting and stuff like that. Where the Europeans were like, "Oh yeah, we're free because we have money and cities and things like that." But he was talking about like, that's not freedom because you have to live to the, by your wages, right? You're controlled by how much money that you have. If you don't have money, you don't have as much freedom as somebody who has more money. And even people who have a lot of money are constrained by where and how they can and when they can use that money, right? And he went into things like laws, like the legal system is extremely, coercive to freedom. The entire hierarchical system that Europe was, had with the kings and the whole royalty and things like that. The whole basically it just was blowing smoke. It just just throwing shots all day, talking about feudalism and things like that. And it got to the point where a lot of the academics in Europe agreed with him, but they couldn't actually say that, right? Because there was no freedom of speech in Europe, right? They would get their hands cut off or their tongues cut off or just beheaded by the aristocracy, however you say that word, if they, talked about these things openly. So what they would do is write letters to or write like newsletters saying, oh, words from a Native American or words from a savage. And they would say his entire argument and say, huh, maybe, having a free, world, this, that, and the other would be interesting. So says, the Native American, so says the savage, right? So they were using him as a proxy for this, this argumentation. right? For this argumentation of the idea of freedom, because before prior to that, a lot of these Europeans had a picture thinking, had a very static idea of what freedom was, and Cony Rock comes over here saying, no, freedom is this, that, and the other, is this, all this other stuff, and that opened their mind to what freedom can be, and that is what started the Enlightenment. That is what started the Enlightenment period. So a lot of the things that we have to thank for our idea of freedom actually comes from the Native Americans. And so, our limits of freedom, living under a capitalist nation and nationalism and all this other stuff, is a kind of vestige, right, of feudalism, of the limited freedoms within feudalism, as opposed to the true freedom that a lot of these Native Americans experienced and advocated for. So it's so interesting that he brought this up, and that this is still a problem. This is a very good kind of use case for why it's so important to have this philosophical understanding of things. Because if you just assume that you know what freedom is, right, then that means that you never question your idea of freedom, and you never question if your idea of freedom is actually not freedom, if your idea of freedom is actually some other person told you freedom should be, right? So this is why philosophy is so goddamn important, man. I love it.
Both of them have, very partial understandings of what
Close
freedom,
my window.
choice, common good, any of these sorts of ideas actually are. Hegel would say that both of them are actually deeply mired in all sorts of varieties of picture thinking. On the other hand, critique, argumentation, what he's calling raisonner in here, offers a kind of freedom from content, but in a certain way it goes too far. It is a freedom that, he says, actually leads to a kind of vanity, a sense of vanity towards it. It can never commit itself to anything. He says, what is looked for here is the effort to give up this freedom. So, what's missing here on the side of picture thinking, on Vorstellung, is it hasn't done the work to free itself from its contingency. Over here, there's the freedom to say, well, it's all contingent, and that itself can end up being a sort of paralyzing stance to take, by which a person doesn't progress, because they can, anything that comes along, they can negate. They can say, well, that's not everything. That's got some flaws to it, and then they never actually do the work of jumping in and seeing where things actually go.
Yeah,
And then looking.
that's a good point too, because this is the problem with like debate bros, right? The idea that you could just argue this, that, and that other topic, and you're like, oh, really? No, this. If the debate bros would argue about freedom, they would say, oh, freedom is this, that, and the other. We have to get this perfect idea of freedom. If it's not this, then blah 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 blah. Here, here's, and somebody comes up with the argument and says, oh, laws are not good because they limit you this, and say, actually, well, you blah 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 blah. And so it's good to have that argument. But if you're just constantly going back and forth and not actually living it, like Cony Rock, he actually lived it. He wasn't just arguing about it. He was actually sharing his ideas of freedom, while the academics in Europe were the ones arguing back and forth. Um, the Native Americans, they were living their idea of freedom, right? So um, you can't just argue back and forth about something. You have to, live it out. You have to, you know, get into it. And that's a great concept here. So saying both of these, ways of knowing and understanding ideas is inherently, limiting, and is missing things.
At it critically again. So he says, what they need to do is to sink this freedom in the content, letting it move spontaneously of its own nature, by the self as its own self, then to contemplate its movement. So what you could think of is, I don't want to say, thesis, antithesis, synthesis, because it's not so simple as that. Which of these is the thesis? Neither one is actually the thesis, and both of them are the thesis. But what Hegel is calling science is supposed to do is combine what's actually good in both of these and strip away the elements that are bad in both of them, and attain something that actually gets us along further. So he says, this refusal to intrude into the immanent rhythm of the notion, either arbitrarily or with a wisdom obtained from elsewhere, constitutes a restraint, which is itself an essential moment of the notion. So it's not just, go full bore and we're going to figure everything out. There is a rhythm to phenomenology. There is a restraint that's required. It's sort of like, we want to do some picture thinking here, and we think about it in terms of eating and dietetics and managing one's food intake. You sit there and you eat, and if you eat fast, you're probably A, not going to digest stuff very well, and B, not tell how much you're eating and probably overeat. So you eat a little bit more slowly, and then you actually start to notice the flavors of things. You say, oh, that actually has an aftertaste. Wait, that's got two aftertastes. Oh, now I see why this dish goes with this one, because they actually pair well. What we're talking about as Begriff here, concept, starts to unfold itself to us when we're receptive to it and show a kind of restraint and don't insist on relying on just one of these things, but
Mm,
actually start piecing things together.
right.
And that can take a long time. I'm perhaps less optimistic than Hegel about the end point for that, and see it as an ongoing process that's never quite finished myself. But I do think it's an advance, especially at this moment, for him to criticize picture thinking, to tell us about that, and to counterpose to it this raisonnieren.
Mm. That was great, as always. Always got some great stuff, some great insights. So there we go. Thanks as always for watching, for listening. Let me know what you thought about this, what you learned from this, what you gleaned from this, and yeah, we'd love to talk about these concepts in the comments below. So that stuff, whatever, blah blah blah. Thanks again, and have a great day. See ya. Bye bye.